This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to tackle a question we got about how World War II basically totally transformed the U.S. economy.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic.
It is.
You think about it, the U.S. enters the war right smack in the middle of the Great Depression.
Right.
And by the end, they're like this global economic powerhouse.
That's incredible.
So how did that happen?
Yeah.
We're going to try to figure that out today.
We'll use this really interesting podcast episode from Mr. Hutchings History. It's called Economic Transformation: The Impact of WWII on the U.S. Economy.
All right, let's dive in.
Right.
The speed of the change is really remarkable.
Yeah.
Just try to picture this.
Okay.
In 1940, the U.S. had an unemployment rate of 14.6%.
Wow.
Factories were just sitting there.
Going on.
The economy was just bleak.
Yeah.
But then you fast forward just a few years to 1945.
Okay.
Total turnaround.
Yeah.
Industries are booming.
Wow.
Almost everyone has a job.
It's really hard to grasp that level of change in such a short time.
Yeah.
Was it just luck? Or did they plan for this to happen? Even before Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt was already pushing for more military production.
It was a really smart move by Roosevelt.
Right.
He saw that war was probably coming.
Yeah?
And he understood that making more stuff for the military would actually help the whole economy.
Makes sense.
So yeah, that early push from him definitely helped to get things going again.
All right, so we know things change really fast, but to really get it, I need some specific examples. The episode talks about Ford's Willow Run plant.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain why that's such an important example?
Willow Run is a perfect example of how things changed during the war.
Okay.
Imagine a factory that normally makes cars,
Right.
but suddenly it's making a B-24 bomber every single hour.
Like a bomber an hour.
Every hour.
That's incredible.
Yeah, that's the kind of scale and speed we're talking about.
So they didn't just make more.
Nope.
They also figured out how to make things faster.
Exactly.
Way more efficiently.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think about a bomber rolling off the assembly line just like a car.
Yeah,
But did that actually affect the whole economy?
absolutely.
Right.
Industrial production doubled during World War II.
Doubled.
The U.S. was making twice as much stuff as before.
And it wasn't just tanks and planes, right?
Right. They had to build new factories, hire more people.
Really ramp things up.
They were basically building a whole new level of economic activity.
Wow. So this wasn't just some temporary wartime thing.
Right.
They were really setting themselves up for growth after the war was over.
Exactly.
I'm guessing all those new factories and all that production created a ton of jobs.
You bet.
Yeah.
17 million new civilian jobs.
Wow.
Think about that.
That's a lot of people.
Millions of people who were unemployed during the Depression suddenly had jobs, were making money and helping out with the war effort.
That must have had a huge impact on families.
Huge.
And all communities?
Wow. All across the country.
It's incredible how a war could cause such big social and economic changes here in the U.S.
It is.
So we all know that picture of Rosie the Riveter.
Yeah.
Strong women working in factories.
Yeah.
But was that just a symbol? Or did women really make a difference in the workforce?
It was way more than just a symbol.
Okay.
More than 6 million women joined the workforce during World War II.
6 million.
They weren't just filling in for the men who were away.
Right.
They proved they could do jobs that people thought only men could do.
Yeah.
And it really changed how people thought about women's role in society.
So the war kind of forced people to rethink their ideas about what women were capable of doing.
Totally.
What about other groups?
Yeah.
Did the war create any opportunities for African Americans?
It's a complicated story.
Oh.
I mean, racism and discrimination were still really bad,
Right.
but there were some good things that happened too.
Like what?
Well, in 1941, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802.
Okay.
It banned discrimination in defense industries.
So that meant African Americans could work in jobs they couldn't before. So it wasn't perfect,
Not at all.
but it was a step in the right direction.
Definitely a step.
And it probably helped lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement later on.
Yeah, because Black Americans saw that they could contribute just as much as anyone else when given the chance.
It's fascinating how this global war could lead to such big changes here in the U.S.
It is.
But war is expensive.
Yeah, incredibly expensive.
So how did the government pay for all of this?
It was a massive effort.
Yeah.
By 1945, the war was costing about $100 million every single day.
$100 million a day.
Every day.
Wow.
I mean, that's more than some countries spend in a whole year.
So where did they get that kind of money?
Well, they did a few things.
Okay.
They issued war bonds, which basically asked people to lend money to the government to support the war.
Interesting.
It made people feel like they were part of the fight,
Yeah.
and it helped the government pay for the war.
So they were crowdfunding the war.
Yeah, basically.
Clever.
They also raised taxes.
Oh, yeah.
Because people knew that winning the war meant making sacrifices,
Right.
and paying higher taxes was part of that.
It sounds like there was a real sense of unity back then.
Definitely.
But I'm guessing they still had to borrow a lot of money too, right?
Yeah, you're right. Borrowing was a big part of it.
Yeah.
The government went into a lot of debt to cover the costs.
It was a risky move.
Yeah, but they were betting that winning the war would be worth it in the long run.
Yeah. Hoping for a big payoff later.
Exactly.
So all that spending on wartime production, that's what led to what President Eisenhower later called the military-industrial complex, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
World War II created a strong connection between the government and the companies that made weapons and other military equipment.
A lot of money flowing back and forth.
Yeah, it was good for both sides. The companies made a lot of money, and the government got the weapons and technology they needed to fight the war.
So the war wasn't just about weapons and fighting. It
Right.
also had a big impact on technology, right?
Absolutely. I mean, think about things like radar and jet engines.
Yeah.
And even the atomic bomb, though we won't get into that right now.
Right.
All of these things came about because of the war.
Yeah.
They changed how wars were fought.
Yeah, for sure.
But they also laid the foundation for new industries and new technologies in the future.
So the war was like a fast track for technological progress.
Exactly like a pressure cooker for innovation.
Okay, so the war changed industries, created jobs, and led to new technologies.
Mm-hmm.
But how did all of this affect America's place in the world?
Well, you have to remember that while Europe and Asia were being destroyed by the war,
Right.
the U.S. was actually getting stronger.
Their factories were still running.
Exactly. By 1945, the U.S. was making almost half of all the manufactured goods in the world.
Half of everything.
It's a crazy statistic.
It is.
It's no wonder they became such a powerful force in the world.
So did all this new economic power lead to any specific actions or policies?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, they used their new economic muscle to shape the world after the war.
Okay.
Like they spearheaded the Marshall Plan, which helped to rebuild Europe.
Right.
And their economic strength was a big reason why the Bretton Woods Agreement happened.
The Bretton Woods Agreement?
Mm-hmm.
I've heard of that, but honestly, I don't really get it.
Yeah, it can be kind of confusing.
Yeah.
Basically, it was a meeting of 44 allied nations back in 1944.
Okay.
And their goal was to come up with a new global financial system.
So in the middle of a world war, they were already thinking about how to prevent future economic problems.
Yeah, pretty forward thinking, right?
Very.
So what came out of Bretton Woods?
Yeah.
Well, some of the most important institutions we have today actually came from that meeting.
Like what?
Things like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF,
Okay.
and the World Bank.
Wow. So the U.S., having become this economic superpower,
Yeah.
they basically use their influence to create a whole new financial system for the world.
Exactly, a huge shift in power.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And one of the biggest outcomes of Bretton Woods was that the U.S. dollar became the world's reserve currency.
So that means the dollar became like the most important currency in the world.
Right, for international trade and finance.
And it still is today.
Yeah.
It's amazing how something that happened during the war could have such a lasting impact on the global financial system.
It is.
But the war's impact went way beyond just economics, right?
Right.
There were big social and cultural changes, too.
Definitely.
We talked about women joining the workforce.
Yeah.
But what happened to those women after the war ended?
It's important to remember that even though a lot of women went back to more traditional roles after the war,
Right.
those years working during the war had a huge impact on them.
Right, in what way?
They had experienced financial independence,
Yeah.
and they had proven that they could do jobs that were typically done by men.
Okay.
And I think that experience planted the seeds for the women's movement that really took off in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, because women started demanding equal rights and opportunities.
Exactly.
So the war, in a way, kind of empowered women to challenge the way things were.
Yeah, definitely.
What about African Americans?
Yeah.
Did their experiences during the war have a similar impact on the civil rights movement?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Even though they face so much discrimination and segregation, Black Americans served their country with honor during World War II,
Yeah.
and fighting for freedom overseas actually made them even more determined to fight for equality back home.
Yeah, I could see that.
Many of them saw how hypocritical it was to be fighting against fascism in Europe
Right.
while still facing racism in their own country.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think that realization really helped to fuel the civil rights movement.
Okay.
Black veterans came home from the war determined to demand their full rights as citizens.
Yeah.
It's remarkable how these wartime experiences led to these huge social movements years later.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It is.
But let's switch gears for a second.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about the good economic effects of the war. But were there any bad ones too? Like, did all this rapid change have any negative consequences?
Of course.
Yeah.
While a lot of people benefited from the wartime boom,
Right.
there were some who were left behind or even hurt by it.
Like who?
Well, for example, Japanese Americans were unjustly interned during the war.
Right.
They lost their homes, their businesses, their freedom.
It's a sad reminder that even when a country is united, terrible things can still happen.
Yeah, a dark side to the story.
So did these negative consequences have a lasting impact?
Sadly, yes.
Yeah.
The internment of Japanese Americans is a really shameful chapter in American history,
Yeah.
and it still affects people today.
It's really sad.
It shows us how dangerous prejudice can be
Yeah.
and how important it is to protect people's rights, even during a crisis.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's shift back to the economic side of things.
Yeah.
What about the average American?
Yeah.
How did all this change during the war affect their lives once the fighting was over?
Think about it. During the war, people were working, they were earning more money, and they were saving more.
Okay.
Because of rationing, they couldn't spend as much.
Right.
So by the end of the war, they had all this saved up money,
Yeah.
and they were really eager to buy things.
Makes sense.
And that combination led to a huge economic boom.
Yeah, everybody wanted to spend money.
Consumer spending went through the roof.
So the war basically set the stage for the rise of the American middle class and all that prosperity in the 1950s.
Exactly.
Yeah, all those classic images of suburban homes and new cars and fancy appliances.
Yep.
It all goes back to the way the economy changed during the war.
It all connects.
It's interesting how those two things are so intertwined.
Yeah.
But this boom wasn't just in the U.S.
Right.
Didn't the war change the whole global economy too?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, because remember, the U.S. came out of the war as the most powerful economy in the world.
Exactly. They had the factories, the money, and the political influence to shape the whole world. So that's why things like the IMF and the World Bank were created.
Right.
Those institutions were meant to stabilize the global economy and make it easier for countries to trade with each other.
So the war, in a sense, kind of set the stage for the interconnected global economy that we have today.
Yeah, it's amazing how it all connects back to that time.
It is.
It is.
It really shows you that historical events can have consequences that last for generations,
You really can.
and that the economic transformation of the U.S. during World War II didn't just affect the U.S., it affected the whole world.
It's a big story.
It's a big story.
A really big story.
Well, we've covered so much in this deep dive.
Yeah.
What would you say are the most important things for our listener to remember about how World War II changed the U.S. economy?
Well, first off, it ended the Great Depression.
Right.
All that government spending, the increase in production, the millions of new jobs,
Yeah.
it all added up to a huge economic recovery.
But it wasn't just about recovering from the Depression.
Right.
It was about the U.S. becoming the biggest economy in the world.
Exactly.
It's crazy to think they went from being in a terrible depression to making almost half of the world's goods.
It is.
And that had to have a big impact on global politics, too.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
It shaped America's role in the world after the war.
How so?
Well, it influenced everything from how Europe and Japan were rebuilt
Okay.
to the Bretton Woods Agreement
Right.
and even the Cold War.
It also led to those big social changes we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
Like women and minorities entering the workforce.
Yeah.
And that had a lasting impact on those groups and on American society as a whole.
It's like one thing led to another.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
And those social changes also had a lasting impact.
Yeah.
Like women and minorities entering the workforce.
Yeah.
They changed how people thought about things.
Definitely.
And they led to future social movements.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that economic transformations are never just about like numbers and statistics. They always have these big social and cultural ripple effects. And those ripple effects can shape societies for generations.
So for everyone listening out there, I hope you're starting to see the full picture of how much World War II changed things. It wasn't just about winning the war. It was about completely reshaping the world.
And it's important to remember that all of these changes, they weren't always like smooth or fair. There were winners and losers, both here in the US and in other parts of the world.
That's a really good point. It's easy to focus on the story of America winning, but it's important to also think about the things that weren't so great and the inequalities that existed back then.
Yeah. For example, while a lot of people benefited from the booming economy during the war, others, like Japanese Americans who were unjustly interned, they faced a lot of discrimination and hardship.
It shows you that even when a country is united and working towards a common goal, there can still be deep divisions and injustices.
Right.
And those historical legacies, they still affect us today.
They do.
They shape how we talk about economic equality and social justice.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important lessons we can learn from studying this period.
Okay.
It forces us to think critically about the stories we've been told and to really try to understand the full complexity of history.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one last thought you want to leave with our listener? Something to think about as they keep learning about this topic.
Well, I think it's really interesting to think about how World War II completely changed the role of government in the economy.
Yeah.
Like, do we see any similarities between that wartime mobilization and how governments intervene during economic crises today?
That's a great question.
Or how might a similar mobilization in the future impact the industries and technologies of tomorrow?
It really makes you think, doesn't it? What if something like that happened again today? What new industries or technologies would emerge? Would we see similar changes in social norms and expectations?
It's fascinating to think about how history might repeat itself, or at least rhyme with the past.
Absolutely. It's amazing how exploring the past can raise so many questions about the future. So to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey through the economic transformation of the U.S. during World War II. We hope you learned something new and maybe even had a few aha moments along the way.
And remember, history isn't just a bunch of facts and dates. It's a story that's still unfolding, and it continues to shape our world today.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep making those connections between the past and the present.
That's how we learn and grow.
We'll see you on our next deep dive. Until then, keep learning and keep those minds engaged.
Yeah, it really shows how economic changes are never just about like the numbers, you know? They always have these big social and cultural impacts that can last for a really long time.
So to our listener out there, I hope this deep dive has helped you see just how big of an impact World War II really had. It wasn't just about winning a war, it was about changing the entire world.
And one of the key things to keep in mind is that all this change, it wasn't always, easy or fair. There were definitely people who benefited more than others, both here in the U.S. and in other parts of the world.
That's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in the idea of America winning and everything being great. But we have to remember that there were also a lot of problems and inequalities during that time.
Yeah, like we talked about earlier. While some people were doing really well because of the booming wartime economy, others, like Japanese Americans who were unfairly sent to internment camps, they suffered a lot.
It's a reminder that even when a country is united and focused on a common goal, there can still be a lot of division and injustice.
Right, and those things from the past, they still affect us today.
Yeah, they definitely do.
They influence how we think about issues like economic fairness and social justice.
Exactly.
And I think that's one of the biggest lessons we can take away from studying this period in history.
Okay.
It makes us question the stories we've been told and really try to understand how complex history actually is.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there anything else you'd like our listener to think about, some kind of final thought to ponder as they continue exploring this topic?
Well, I think it's worth considering how World War II completely changed the role of government in the economy. Like, do we see any of those changes reflected in how governments handle economic crises today? Or how might a similar kind of mobilization in the future affect the kinds of industries and technologies we develop?
Those are great questions to think about. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If something like World War II happened again today, what new industries or technologies might come out of it? Would we see the same kind of shifts in social norms and expectations?
It's really fascinating to consider how history might repeat itself, or at least rhyme with the past.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing how looking back at history can make us ask so many questions about the future. So to everyone listening out there, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the economic transformation of the U.S. during World War II. We hope you learned some new things and maybe even had a few aha moments along the way.
And remember, history isn't just a bunch of facts and dates in a textbook. It's a living story that's still unfolding, and it still shapes our world today.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep making those connections between the past and the present.
Because that's how we learn and grow.
We'll see you on our next deep dive. Until then, keep learning and stay curious.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.